The boat tipped before I could even process what was happening. One moment I was adjusting my pack, watching the murky water slide past our small motorized canoe, feeling the sweat pool at the small of my back in the oppressive humidity. The next, chaos. A violent jolt, the guide's panicked shout, and suddenly sky and water inverted. I hit the brown water with a slap that knocked the air from my lungs. The Amazon swallowed me whole. Underwater, I fought against the current, my lungs burning. My heavy pack dragged me down like an anchor. The buckle across my chest, the one I'd carefully fastened minutes before, now trapped me. My fingers, clumsy with panic, fumbled at the clasp. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision as I wrestled with the straps. Finally, the buckle released. I kicked upward, breaking the surface with a desperate gasp that pulled as much water as air into my throat. I coughed violently, treading water as I tried to orient myself. "Marco!" I called out for our guide between coughs. "Elena!" My traveling companion's name echoed across the water. No response. The overturned boat drifted about 20 meters downstream. I swam toward it, fighting the current. My muscles, already fatigued from 3 days of hiking to reach this remote tributary, screamed in protest. Something brushed against my leg underwater. Plant matter, I told myself, not allowing my mind to consider alternatives. I reached the hull and clung to it, scanning the shoreline. Dense jungle pressed up against the riverbank, a wall of green that seemed to watch me with indifference. No sign of Marco or Elena. "Hello!" I shouted again. The jungle swallowed my voice. As my breathing steadied, I became aware of a stinging sensation on my forearm. A gash about 3 inches long ran from my wrist toward my elbow, seeping blood into the water. Must have hit something during the capsizing, not deep but bleeding freely. A memory surfaced, Marco's safety briefing 3 days ago when we'd first set out from Manaus. His accented English describing the river's hazards. "If you are bleeding in these waters, you must get out immediately. The piranhas, they can smell blood from great distance." I looked down at the red trail dispersing from my arm into the brown water. My heart rate, which had just begun to slow, doubled. Movement in the water caught my eye. A ripple, then another. Small shadows darting beneath the surface, converging. I'd come to the Amazon to escape my demons, not to feed them. The irony wasn't lost on me as I kicked away from the boat toward the nearest shore, my wounded arm held above the water. I dragged myself onto the muddy bank, collapsing onto my hands and knees. Water streamed from my clothes as I crawled further from the river's edge. The wound on my arm throbbed, still leaking blood that now mixed with mud. "Marco! Elena!" I called again, scanning the shoreline in both directions. Nothing but the endless green wall of vegetation and the brown snake of river. I sat back on my heels, taking stock. The sun indicated mid-afternoon, perhaps 3 or 4 hours of daylight left. I had no pack, no supplies, no map. Just the clothes on my back, soaked through and already uncomfortable in the humid air. And a bleeding wound in piranha-infested waters. First things first, I tore a strip from the bottom of my shirt, a quick, dry hiking shirt that had cost more than I'd like to admit, and wrapped it tightly around my forearm. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. The memory of those converging shadows in the water sent a shiver through me. I'd read enough about piranhas to know that their reputation was partly exaggerated. They didn't typically attack large animals unless they were already wounded or dead. But wounded described me perfectly at the moment. I forced myself to think clearly. Priorities: stop bleeding, find Marco and Elena, locate supplies, signal for help. In that order. Looking around, I spotted a plant with broad, waxy leaves. I'd spent months researching Amazonian flora before this trip, part of my attempt to focus on something, anything, other than Sarah's death. This was a species of heliconia, if I wasn't mistaken. I gathered several leaves, cleaned the wound as best I could with water from my cupped hands, then bound it with the makeshift bandage. With my immediate medical needs addressed, I stood on shaky legs and surveyed my surroundings. The overturned boat had continued downstream, now barely visible around a bend. If Marco and Elena had surfaced, they might have swum to the opposite shore or further downstream. "Hello," I shouted again, cupping my hands around my mouth. "Marco, Elena." Only the distant calls of birds and the constant symphony of insects answered. I knew I should stay put. Every wilderness survival guide emphasized the same point. If you're lost, stay where you are. Make yourself visible. Wait for rescue. But no one knew exactly where we were. Marco had navigated by memory and instinct, taking us up this unmarked tributary because Elena wanted to photograph birds away from the tourist routes. Our planned return wasn't for another 4 days. No one would miss us yet. I closed my eyes, trying to recall the map I'd studied. We'd traveled north from Manaus, then east along this tributary. The nearest village was at least a day's journey by boat. On foot, through the jungle? I had no idea. A rustling in the undergrowth snapped me back to attention. Something large was moving through the dense vegetation about 20 meters inland. I froze, watching as the leaves swayed. Then I caught a glimpse of sleek black fur, a jaguar. It paused, and for a heart-stopping moment, its amber eyes locked with mine. Neither of us moved. I barely breathed. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the jaguar turned and melted back into the jungle. The encounter left me trembling. I couldn't stay here on the exposed shoreline. I needed shelter, and I needed to find the others. With one last look at the river, I made my decision. I would follow the shoreline downstream, hoping to find Marco, Elena, or the boat, preferably all three. As I walked, the weight of my situation began to sink in. I was alone in one of the most remote and dangerous environments on Earth, with night approaching and no supplies. The familiar tightness gripped my chest, the same panic that had plagued me since finding Sarah's body in our bathtub 11 months ago. "Not now," I muttered, forcing deep breaths. "Not here. One step at a time, just like the grief counselor had said, one step at a time." Dusk descended rapidly, as it always does near the equator. One moment I was picking my way along the muddy shoreline. The next, shadows had swallowed the jungle, leaving only silhouettes against the darkening sky. I had found nothing, no sign of Marco or Elena, no glimpse of our boat or supplies. Just endless riverbank, occasionally interrupted by fallen trees or small tributaries that forced me to wade through chest-deep water, my wounded arm held high. Each time I entered the water, I imagined teeth tearing at my legs, but nothing came. Perhaps the piranhas were elsewhere, or perhaps they'd lost interest once my blood was no longer leaking into their domain. With darkness closing in, I knew I needed shelter. The temperature would drop overnight, and my clothes were still damp. Hypothermia was a real risk, even in the tropics. And then there were the predators, jaguars hunted primarily at night. I found a spot where several trees had fallen, creating a natural hollow above the floodline. Using what little daylight remained, I gathered palm fronds and broad leaves, weaving them between branches to create a crude roof. The shelter wouldn't keep out determined predators, but it might hide me from casual notice. As I worked, memories of a camping trip with Sarah 3 years earlier surfaced unbidden. We'd been caught in a sudden storm in the Adirondacks, our tent blown away. We'd built an emergency shelter not unlike this one, huddling together through the night, laughing despite the discomfort. "See," she'd said, "we make a good team when things go sideways." The memory hit like a physical blow. I paused, breathing deeply until the wave of grief receded. With my shelter complete, I crawled inside just as true darkness fell. The jungle transformed at night. New sounds emerged, the deep, resonant croaks of frogs, the buzz of night insects, occasional splashes from the river, and other sounds, harder to identify, rustlings, snappings, low growls that raised the hair on my neck. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. I hadn't eaten since a small breakfast of fruit and bread on the boat. Thirst was worse. Despite being surrounded by water, I hadn't dared drink from the river. Too many parasites, bacteria, and other microscopic threats lurked in those brown waters. I knew I could survive 3 days without water, but I'd be severely compromised after just one. Finding clean water would be tomorrow's priority. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds or the occasional raindrop finding its way through my makeshift roof. Each time I drifted off, my dreams filled with swirling water and darting shadows with razor teeth. Once I jerked awake, convinced something was crawling on my leg, only to find it was a large leaf that had fallen onto my shelter. During one wakeful period I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, a human scream, distant but distinct. I sat up, straining to hear more, but it didn't repeat. Had I imagined it? Was it Elena or Marco? Or perhaps just some nocturnal bird with a too human call? I crawled to the edge of my shelter, peering into the impenetrable darkness. "Hello?" I called, not too loudly. Nothing answered except the usual chorus of jungle sounds. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I fell into a deeper sleep just before dawn. Morning brought renewed hope and fresh challenges. I emerged from my shelter stiff and sore, my wound throbbing beneath its improvised bandage. The rising sun cast long shadows through the trees, illuminating mist rising from the river's surface. My priorities hadn't changed: find water, find food, find Marco and Elena, or our supplies. I decided to continue downstream, staying close to the shoreline. If the others had survived, they would likely do the same. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled for anything useful. The jungle offered resources for those who knew what to look for. I spotted a cluster of palm trees and remembered Marco explaining that many species stored drinkable water in their trunks. Using a sharp stone, I managed to puncture one trunk, collecting the clear liquid that seeped out in cupped leaves. The water tasted slightly sweet and eased my parched throat. Food proved more challenging. I recognized some edible fruits, small berries and nuts that Marco had pointed out during our hike, but they barely took the edge off my hunger. I needed protein, and that meant fishing or trapping. By midday, I had fashioned a crude spear from a straight branch, sharpening one end with my stone tool. I waded carefully into a shallow pool where the river curved, staying alert for any sign of piranhas. The water was clearer here, and I could see small fish darting among the submerged roots. After nearly an hour of frustrated attempts, I managed to spear a fish about the size of my hand. I felt a surge of primitive triumph as I carried it back to shore. Using dry leaves and twigs, I managed to start a small fire by the friction method, something I'd practiced during preparation for this trip, but never actually needed until now. The fish, roasted over open flames, was the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted, despite being undercooked in places and charred in others. As I ate, picking tiny bones from between my teeth, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I was surviving. That feeling evaporated when I heard a sound that didn't belong, a mechanical whine, distant but unmistakable, a boat motor. I scrambled to my feet, running to the water's edge. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms frantically. "Over here!" The sound grew louder, then I spotted it, a small motorized canoe similar to ours, rounding the bend upstream. 2 figures were visible, neither of them Marco or Elena. "Help!" I continued waving as the boat approached. The men inside, locals, judging by their appearance, spotted me and guided their craft toward shore. They spoke rapidly in Portuguese, which I didn't understand beyond a few basic phrases. "English?" I asked hopefully. "Espanol?" One of the men nodded. "Little English," he said. "You tourist? Lost?" "Yes," I explained about the capsized boat, about Marco and Elena. "Have you seen them, or our boat?" They exchanged glances, then the English speaker shook his head. "No other people, but boat, yes, downriver, caught in trees." My heart leapt. "Can you take me there?" Another exchange in Portuguese, then a nod. "We take you, but careful. Bad water ahead." rapids. As I climbed into their boat, I noticed fishing equipment, nets, lines, and several large knives. These were local fishermen, probably from the village Marco had mentioned. We traveled downstream for about 20 minutes before the man at the front pointed. There, tangled in a fallen tree that stretched halfway across the river, was our canoe, still overturned. "There," I said. "Can we get to it?" The fisherman at the motor shook his head. "Too dangerous. Water fast here." Looking at the rushing current around the fallen tree, I could see he was right. The calm river I'd been following had transformed into a series of small rapids. Our boat must have been carried here after capsizing. "Look," said the English speaker, pointing at something on the shore near the trapped canoe. I squinted, then felt my stomach drop. A bright blue backpack, Elena's camera bag, lay on the muddy bank. "We need to go there," I insisted. The fishermen clearly didn't like the idea, but eventually relented. They navigated carefully to a spot about 50 meters upstream from the backpack, then guided the boat to shore. "We wait here," said the English speaker. "You go look, but quick, need to return to village before dark." I nodded gratefully and made my way along the shore toward Elena's bag. The terrain was trickier here, with large boulders and fallen trees blocking the shoreline in places. I had to climb over some and wade through shallow water around others. When I reached the backpack, my hopes fell. It was empty. No camera, no supplies, just the waterlogged bag itself. But its presence meant Elena had made it at least this far. I scanned the area, looking for footprints or any sign of where she might have gone. The muddy bank held no clear tracks, but I noticed broken vegetation leading into the jungle as if someone had pushed through in haste. "Elena!" I called. "Marco!" Only jungle sounds answered. I faced a terrible choice. The fishermen were my ticket back to civilization, to help and resources. But Elena and Marco might be nearby, injured or lost. How could I leave without knowing? The memory of that human scream in the night haunted me. Had it been Elena, Marco, or just my imagination? As I stood there, torn, something caught my eye. A flash of red among the green about 10 meters into the jungle. I moved closer, pushing aside vines and branches. It was blood, smeared on leaves at about chest height, as if someone bleeding had pushed through here, fresh enough to still be bright red. "Elena!" I called again, more urgently. "Marco!" The blood trail continued deeper into the jungle. I followed it, forgetting momentarily about the waiting fishermen. The vegetation grew denser, making progress difficult. The blood marks appeared intermittently, on a leaf here, a tree trunk there, leading me further from the river. After about 50 meters, the trail opened into a small clearing. What I saw there stopped me cold. Marco's machete lay on the ground, its blade darkened with dried blood. Beside it, a torn piece of clothing, the same pattern as the shirt Elena had been wearing. The ground showed signs of a struggle, disturbed earth, broken plants, more blood spatter. But no bodies. A low growl from the edge of the clearing made me spin around. There, partially hidden in the undergrowth, was the jaguar I'd seen the previous day, or one very similar. Its amber eyes fixed on me, muscles tensed, as if preparing to pounce. I slowly bent down, never breaking eye contact, and picked up Marco's machete. The jaguar's growl deepened. We faced each other across the clearing, predator and prey, in a primeval standoff. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd read that you should never run from a big cat. It triggers their chase instinct. But standing my ground seemed equally suicidal. The jaguar took a step forward, its powerful shoulders rolling beneath glossy black fur. I raised the machete, trying to look larger and more threatening than I felt. A shout from the direction of the river broke the tension. The jaguar's ears flicked, and after a final assessing stare, it turned and disappeared into the jungle as silently as it had appeared. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my legs suddenly weak. The fishermen were calling for me. I needed to go back. But what about Elena and Marco? The evidence in the clearing told a grim story. The blood, the signs of struggle, the jaguar. I didn't want to complete the thought. With a heavy heart, I turned back toward the river, clutching Marco's machete and the torn piece of Elena's shirt. The fishermen would take me to their village. From there, I could organize a proper search party. It was the rational choice, even if it felt like abandonment. As I pushed back through the vegetation, following my own trail of broken plants, a memory surfaced. Sarah, in one of our last conversations before her depression, overwhelmed her. "Sometimes surviving means making the hard choice," she'd said, "the one that feels wrong but keeps you alive." I hadn't understood what she meant then. I was beginning to now. The fishermen's village consisted of about 20 structures, a mix of traditional thatched huts and more modern buildings with corrugated metal roofs. It sat on slightly elevated ground about half a kilometer from the river, surrounded by cleared land where crops grew in neat rows. We arrived just as dusk was falling. My new companions, who had introduced themselves as Paulo and João, guided their boat to a small wooden dock where several similar craft were tied. As we approached, children playing nearby spotted us and ran toward the village, shouting excitedly. By the time we reached the central clearing, a small crowd had gathered. An older man stepped forward, speaking rapidly to Paulo and João while eyeing me with cautious curiosity. "This is Chief," Paulo explained to me. "He asked why we bring stranger." I let Paulo translate as I explained my situation, the capsized boat, my missing companions, the evidence I'd found. As the story unfolded, the villagers' expressions grew grave. When Paulo described the blood and torn clothing, several made warding gestures. The chief spoke at length, Paulo nodding occasionally. "He say jaguar attack not common, but happen sometimes," Paulo translated. "Last rainy season, hunter from village disappear. Only find blood and torn clothes like your friends." My stomach tightened. "Ask him if there's any chance they survived." More conversation, then Paulo turned back to me. "He say jaguar very strong, if attack 2 people, not likely they live." I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. I had known this was the probable explanation, but hearing it confirmed made it real. "He also say we cannot search now," Paulo continued. "Night coming. Jaguar hunt at night. Tomorrow men from village will help look for bodies." Bodies, not survivors. The finality of the word hit me hard. An older woman approached, speaking softly to the chief. He nodded, then gestured to me. "Anita will give you place to sleep," Paulo explained. "Food too. Tomorrow we search." I followed the woman to a small hut at the edge of the village. Inside was simple but clean, a hammock strung across one end, a low table, some cooking implements hanging from the walls. Anita gestured for me to sit on a wooden stool, then left, returning minutes later with a bowl of some kind of stew and a cup of water. The food was simple but nourishing: fish, root vegetables, and herbs in a savory broth. As I ate, Anita busied herself around the hut, occasionally glancing at me with what seemed like concern. When I finished, she approached and pointed to my arm, where the makeshift bandage had become dirty and partially unwrapped. I nodded, understanding her intent, and she gently removed the bandage, examining the wound underneath. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly, then retrieved a small wooden box from a shelf. Inside were various natural remedies: leaves, powders, a sticky substance that looked like honey. She cleaned the wound with water, applied some of the honey-like substance, then wrapped it with a clean cloth. "Obrigado," I said, one of the few Portuguese words I knew. "Thank you." She smiled, nodded, then pointed to the hammock. The message was clear: rest. As darkness settled completely outside, I lay in the gently swinging hammock, staring at the thatched roof. The events of the past 2 days played on repeat in my mind: the capsizing, the blood in the water, the jaguar's amber eyes, the clearing with its signs of violence. I thought of Elena, so vibrant and passionate about her wildlife photography, and Marco, whose knowledge of the jungle had seemed limitless. Both gone, just like that, just like Sarah. The familiar weight of guilt settled on my chest. I should have done something differently, should have searched longer, called louder, moved faster. The rational part of my brain knew these thoughts were pointless. What happened wasn't my fault, but rationality offered little comfort in the darkness. Sleep eventually came, but it brought no peace. My dreams were a chaotic blend of past and present traumas, Sarah's lifeless body in our bathtub, merging with images of Elena and Marco being dragged away by a shadow with gleaming teeth. I woke several times, disoriented and sweating despite the cool night air. Dawn broke with the sounds of the village coming to life, voices calling, children laughing, the clatter of cooking implements. I emerged from the hut to find a group of men gathered in the central clearing, armed with machetes, spears, and one ancient-looking rifle. Paulo spotted me and waved me over. "We go search now," he said. "Chief say 10 men will help." I nodded gratefully. "I want to come too." "Yes, you show where you find blood." We set out as the sun cleared the tops of the trees, following the river downstream to where our boat remained trapped in the fallen tree. The journey took longer by foot than it had by boat, requiring us to navigate the increasingly rocky shoreline. When we reached the spot where I'd found Elena's backpack, I led the search party into the jungle, following the same path I'd taken the day before. The clearing looked different in the morning light, less ominous, but no less disturbing. The machete and torn cloth were still there, along with the dried blood. The village men spread out, examining the ground and surrounding vegetation with experienced eyes. They called to each other in Portuguese, pointing and discussing. I watched helplessly, unable to understand their rapid conversation. After about 20 minutes, one of the men called out, holding up something he'd found at the edge of the clearing. Paulo translated, "Jaguar tracks, big one." Another discovery followed, drag marks leading away from the clearing deeper into the jungle. We followed this grim trail for nearly a kilometer, the vegetation growing denser and the ground becoming steeper as we moved away from the river. The trail ended at the base of a massive kapok tree. One of the villagers pointed silently to a dark stain on the trunk about 2 meters up, blood. Then he directed my gaze higher, to where large branches created a natural platform. "Jaguar take prey into tree," Paulo explained quietly. "To eat?" I swallowed hard, looking up at the blood-stained branches. "Do you see? Remains?" Paulo conferred with the others, then shook his head. "Nothing left. Jaguar very thorough. Maybe bones scattered by scavengers." The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. This was it, the end of Elena and Marco's story. No dramatic rescue, no miraculous survival, just the brutal efficiency of nature's food chain. The search party continued looking for a while longer, finding scattered evidence that confirmed our fears. A shoe that had belonged to Marco, more torn fabric, a few small bones that no one would definitively identify, but that we all knew were human. As we made our way back to the village, I felt hollow. I had come to the Amazon seeking something, escape, perhaps, or a way to process Sarah's suicide. Instead, I had found only more loss, more death. The village chief was waiting when we returned. After hearing the search party's report, he turned to me, speaking through Paulo. "Chief say radio operator come to village tomorrow. Can call for help, arrange transport back to Manaus." I nodded numbly. Thank him for all the help. "He also say you very lucky. Few survive alone in jungle, even for short time." Lucky. The word felt wrong, obscene even. Elena and Marco weren't lucky. Sarah hadn't been lucky. And my survival didn't feel like luck. It felt like an accident, a cosmic oversight. As evening approached, the village gathered for what Paulo explained was a ceremony to honor the dead and protect the living. They built a fire in the central clearing, and the chief led prayers in Portuguese, occasionally throwing herbs into the flames that released aromatic smoke. I sat apart, watching the flames dance. Tomorrow, I would begin the journey back to civilization, back to a world that now held even less for me than it had before. The thought brought no relief, no sense of survival's triumph, just emptiness. The radio operator arrived mid-morning, a government employee who traveled between remote villages, carrying news and facilitating communication with the outside world. He set up his equipment in the chief's hut while Paulo explained my situation. "He call river police," Paulo told me. "They come by boat tomorrow, take you to Manaus. Also report about your friends." I nodded, the reality of leaving sinking in. "I need to contact their families," I said, more to myself than to Paulo. "Police will help with this," he assured me. "Very sorry about friends." "Thank you," I said automatically. The words felt inadequate for all the village had done for me. With my departure arranged, I found myself at loose ends. Paulo had returned to fishing, and the other villagers were busy with their daily tasks. I wandered to the edge of the cleared area, staring into the wall of jungle that had claimed Elena and Marco. A small hand tugged at my shirt. I looked down to find a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, looking up at me with solemn eyes. She held out a small woven bracelet made of colored fibers. "Para você," she said. "For you." I knelt down to her level. "Obrigado," I said, accepting the gift. She smiled shyly, then tied it around my wrist with surprising dexterity. "Proteção," she added, touching the bracelet. "Protection." Before I could respond, she darted away, disappearing between the huts. I looked down at the bracelet, a simple thing of red, blue, and yellow fibers, intricately woven together. A talisman against the jungle's dangers, perhaps. Too late for Elena and Marco. Too late for me, in many ways. That night, my last in the village, I couldn't sleep. I lay in Anita's hammock, listening to the sounds of the jungle beyond the settlement's edge. The screech of monkeys, the constant chorus of insects, the occasional splash from the river, a symphony of life continuing indifferently to human tragedy. My mind drifted to Sarah, as it often did in quiet moments. I remembered finding her, the bathroom floor slick with water overflowing from the tub, her skin cold and bluish, the empty pill bottle on the counter. The paramedics had to physically pull me away from her. "There's nothing you can do, sir," one had said. "She's been gone for hours." Hours. While I was at work, answering emails and attending meetings, Sarah had been dying, just as I'd been hiking along the riverbank while Elena and Marco were being torn apart by a jaguar. Always too late, always failing those who needed me. Dawn found me still awake, sitting outside the hut watching the village come to life. Anita brought me a cup of strong coffee and a piece of flatbread. She pointed to my bandaged arm and mimed unwrapping it. The wound looked better, less inflamed, the edges beginning to heal. Anita nodded approvingly as she applied more of her honey-like remedy and rewrapped it with clean cloth. "You are a good healer," I told her, knowing she probably didn't understand the words, but hoping my tone conveyed my gratitude. She patted my hand and said something in Portuguese that sounded kind. Mid-morning, a commotion at the river announced the arrival of the police boat. 2 officers in khaki uniforms made their way to the village, accompanied by several of the fishermen. Paulo acted as translator as I gave my statement, the capsizing, my survival, the evidence we'd found of Elena and Marco's fate. One officer took notes while the other asked questions through Paulo. Yes, I was certain it was a jaguar. No, I hadn't actually seen the attack. Yes, we had found definitive evidence that both victims were deceased. No, there weren't enough remains to recover. The bureaucracy of death, reduced to checkbox answers on a form. When they were satisfied, the senior officer shook my hand. "We will inform the Brazilian and American consulates," Paulo translated. "They will contact families. You come now to Manaus for official statement, then can go home." Home. The word echoed hollowly. What home? An empty apartment in Seattle with Sarah's ghost in every room? I gathered my few possessions, Marco's machete, which the chief had cleaned and sheathed for me, Elena's torn shirt fragment, which I couldn't bring myself to discard, and the woven bracelet from the little girl. I said goodbye to Anita, to the chief, to Paulo and João, and the others who had helped me. "You always welcome," Paulo said, as we walked to the waiting boat. "But maybe next time, stay on Main River, yes? With tour group." His attempt at humor carried an undercurrent of genuine concern. "I think my jungle days are over," I replied. The journey back to Manaus took most of the day, the police boat making better time than our original expedition had. As we traveled, I watched the endless green shoreline pass by, trying to process everything that had happened. By the time we reached the city, with its noisy docks and crowded streets, I felt like a different person than the one who had left a week earlier. The officers escorted me to a small police station where I repeated my statement, this time with an official translator. They took my passport information, had me sign several forms, and informed me that the American consulate had been notified. "A representative will contact you tomorrow," the translator explained. "We have arranged a hotel room for tonight. There will be more questions, I'm afraid." I was too numb to care. Let them ask their questions. Let them file their reports. None of it would bring Elena and Marco back. None of it would fill the emptiness that seemed to have expanded inside me, consuming whatever person I had been before the Amazon. The hotel was basic but clean, a step up from Anita's hut, but lacking its simple warmth. I showered for the first time in days, watching dirt and dried blood swirl down the drain. The mirror showed a stranger, thinner, with several days' worth of beard, dark circles under hollow eyes. I ordered room service but barely touched the food when it arrived. Instead, I sat on the bed staring at the bland hotel artwork, a generic landscape that couldn't have been further from the vital, dangerous reality of the actual Amazon. My phone, recovered from my luggage that had remained at the hotel during our expedition, had dozens of notifications, emails, news alerts, social media updates. The trivial concerns of a world that continued to spin while lives were lost. I turned it off without reading any of them. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless, the sleep of complete exhaustion. I woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was, half expecting to hear jungle sounds instead of the hum of the hotel's air conditioning. The consulate representative arrived mid-morning, a brisk woman named Carolyn who expressed appropriate sympathy before getting down to business. "We've contacted Ms. Reyes's family in California and Mr. Oliveira's family here in Brazil," she explained. "They're understandably devastated. They may want to speak with you at some point, but for now, they've asked for privacy." I nodded, relieved to postpone those conversations. "As for you," she continued, "we've arranged a flight back to Seattle tomorrow morning. The Brazilian authorities are satisfied with your statement, though there will be some paperwork regarding the death certificates, since there are no remains." She hesitated on the last word, a crack in her professional demeanor. "Thank you," I said, the words automatic. "Is there someone who can meet you when you arrive home? Family, perhaps, or a friend?" I thought about it. My parents were both dead, no siblings. Friends had drifted away during the past year as I withdrew into grief after Sarah's death. "No," I said simply. "There's no one." Carolyn's expression softened. "I can provide contacts for support services, grief counseling, trauma specialists, what you've been through." "I'll be fine," I interrupted, not wanting her pity. "This isn't my first loss." She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead handed me an envelope with my flight information and various documents. "The consulate will cover the expenses. If you need anything before your flight, please call this number." After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed, envelope in hand, feeling adrift. Tomorrow I would board a plane and leave the Amazon behind, leave Elena and Marco behind, return to the life I'd been trying to escape when I signed up for this expedition. But something fundamental had changed. The river, the jungle, the jaguar. They had stripped away layers of civilization, of pretense. In that clearing, watching the predator assess whether to add me to its kill count, I had felt more alive than at any point since finding Sarah's body. Not happier, not better, but undeniably, intensely present in my own existence. I looked down at the woven bracelet still circling my wrist. Protosome. Not from death. Death came for everyone eventually, sometimes by water, sometimes by tooth and claw. But perhaps protection from something worse. The numbness that had enveloped me since Sarah's suicide, the sleepwalking through life that had brought me to the Amazon in the first place. I had survived while others died. There was no logic to it, no justice, just the random brutality of existence and the equally random gift of continued breath. What would I do with that gift now? The question hung in the air, unanswered but insistent, as I began to pack for the journey home. The flight from Manaus to Miami was a blur of recycled air and dimmed cabin lights. I declined food, declined entertainment, declined conversation with the concerned flight attendant who noticed I hadn't moved for hours. In Miami, I faced a 5-hour layover before the connecting flight to Seattle. The international terminal buzzed with activity, travelers rushing to gates, reuniting with loved ones, arguing over luggage. Normal life continuing all around me while I stood still, a rock in a stream, currents of humanity flowing past. I found a quiet corner near my departure gate and sat, watching. A family reunion unfolded nearby, grandparents meeting a baby for the first time, tears and laughter mingling. At another gate, a business traveler argued intensely on his phone about market projections and quarterly reports. 2 teenage girls took selfies, pouting dramatically, then dissolving into giggles. All of them existing in a world where the Amazon was just a place on a map, where piranhas were cartoon villains, where jaguars were majestic creatures safely viewed through television screens or zoo glass. My phone pinged, an email from Elena's sister. I'd given the consulate my contact information to pass along to the families. The message was brief, asking if we could talk when I felt up to it. She wanted to hear about her sister's last days, she said. Wanted to know if Elena had been happy before the end. I closed the email without responding. What could I say? That her final moments had likely been terror and pain? That her body had been consumed until nothing recognizable remained? Some truths were too brutal to share. The Seattle flight boarded on time. As we took off, I watched the Miami coastline recede, then disappear beneath clouds. Hours later, the familiar green landscape of the Pacific Northwest came into view, so different from the Amazon's dense jungle, yet still a wilderness in its own right. Rain greeted me at SeaTac Airport, a gentle northwest drizzle that felt like home in a way nothing else had. I caught a taxi to my apartment building in Capitol Hill, the driver making several attempts at conversation before giving up in the face of my monosyllabic responses. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier, clean but impersonal, like a hotel suite someone had lived in for too long. After Sarah's death, I'd moved from our shared home in Ballard to this sterile high-rise, bringing few possessions and fewer memories. I stood in the entryway, luggage at my feet, suddenly uncertain what to do next. The silence pressed in, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic 12 stories below. Sleep seemed impossible, despite my exhaustion. Instead, I unpacked Marco's machete and Elena's torn shirt fragment, placing them on the coffee table like artifacts from another life. The woven bracelet remained on my wrist, the only thing connecting me to the Amazon, to the village, to the reality of what had happened. My phone rang, startling me. Unknown number. Hello? My voice sounded rusty from disuse. Is this Daniel Reeves? A woman's voice, professional but warm. Yes? Mr. Reeves, my name is Dr. Melissa Chen. I'm a psychologist specializing in trauma and grief. The American consulate in Brazil asked me to reach out to you. I sighed. I don't need therapy. Perhaps not, she replied, unfazed. But sometimes, after experiencing what you've been through, it helps to talk to someone who understands trauma responses. With all due respect, Doctor, unless you've watched people get eaten by a jaguar, I don't think you understand my trauma responses. A pause. Actually, Mr. Reeves, I spent 2 years with Doctors Without Borders in conflict zones. I've seen people torn apart, though by bombs rather than animals. The human response to witnessing such things is remarkably consistent. I had no ready reply to that. I'm not asking you to commit to therapy, she continued. Just one conversation. My office or a coffee shop, your choice. Something in her direct approach broke through my resistance. Fine. One conversation. We arranged to meet the following afternoon at a quiet cafe near her office. After hanging up, I felt a flicker of something, not hope exactly, but perhaps a distant cousin to it. A recognition that I was still part of the world of the living, still connected to humanity, despite everything. The next morning, I woke from troubled dreams of dark water and amber eyes. The Seattle rain had intensified overnight, drumming against my windows. I showered, shaved off the beard I'd grown in the jungle, and dressed in clean clothes that felt strangely formal after days in the same mud-stained hiking outfit. The cafe Dr. Chen had suggested was a small place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop. She was already there when I arrived, a petite Asian woman in her 40s with short, practical hair and intelligent eyes. Mr. Reeves, she stood to greet me. Thank you for coming. Daniel, I said, sliding into the chair opposite her. If we're going to talk about my various traumas, we might as well be on a first-name basis. She smiled slightly. Melissa, then. The waitress came for our order. Coffee for me, tea for her. When we were alone again, Melissa leaned forward. I've read the report from Brazil, but I'd like to hear what happened in your own words. I hesitated, then began talking, haltingly at first, then with increasing fluency as the dam broke. I told her everything, the capsizing, the wound, the blood in the water, the fishermen, the village, the search, the evidence in the clearing. I described the jaguar's eyes, the way time seemed to stop during our confrontation. I told her about the little girl's bracelet, about Anita's silent kindness, about Paulo's attempt at humor as I left. Melissa listened without interruption, her expression attentive, but not pitying. When I finally fell silent, she nodded thoughtfully. And before this trip, she asked? The consulate mentioned you'd experienced another loss recently. I looked down at my coffee, now cold and untouched. My wife, Sarah, she took her own life last year. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry, I said, a edge creeping into my voice. Doesn't bring her back. Doesn't bring Elena or Marco back either. No, Melissa agreed. Nothing does that. We sat in silence for a moment. Can I ask why you went to the Amazon? She finally said. It seems like an unusual choice for someone grieving. I considered the question. I needed something real, something that wasn't filtered through social media or sanitized for mass consumption. Sarah's death was so clean in a way. Pills, bath water, no blood, no violence, just absence. I think I needed to see that death isn't always like that it can be messy and primal and honest, Melissa suggested. Yes, I said, surprised by her understanding. Honest, she nodded. There's a concept in psychology called complicated grief. It's when the normal grieving process gets interrupted or disrupted. Finding your wife's body, blaming yourself for not being there, these could contribute to complicated grief. And watching two people get killed by a jaguar helps with that? I couldn't keep the sarcasm from my voice. Not helps, necessarily. But sometimes one trauma can shake loose another, create movement where there was stagnation. I thought about that, about the numbness that had enveloped me after Sarah's death, and how the Amazon had burned it away, replacing it with raw, painful awareness. "So what now?" I asked. "How do I live with all this?" Melissa considered me for a moment. "That's the question, isn't it? Not just for you, but for anyone who's experienced profound loss or trauma. How do we continue? How do we make meaning?" "And the answer is different for everyone," she said, "but it usually involves connection, finding ways to remain engaged with life, with other people, not despite the pain, but alongside it." I twisted the woven bracelet around my wrist. "I'm not sure I know how to do that anymore." "Few of us do naturally," she said. "It's a skill we develop, sometimes with help." She reached into her bag and pulled out a card. "This is my direct number. Call any time, day or night. And if you're willing, I'd like to see you professionally." I took the card, turning it over in my fingers. "I'll think about it." As I left the cafe, the rain had lightened to a mist that hung in the air, refracting the afternoon light. I walked without destination, moving through the familiar streets of my city as if seeing them for the first time. The Amazon had changed me, not by healing or fixing what was broken, but by showing me that brokenness was part of the natural order. The river didn't mourn the fish consumed by piranhas. The jungle didn't grieve for animals taken by jaguars. Life flowed on, incorporating loss into its endless cycle. I stopped at a small park, watching a group of children play despite the damp weather, their laughter carrying on the moist air. One child fell, began to cry, was comforted by a parent, then rejoined the game, the entire cycle of pain and recovery compressed into minutes. My phone buzzed. Elena's sister again, asking if I'd received her email. This time I replied, "Yes, I was back in Seattle. Yes, we could talk soon." Yes, Elena had been doing what she loved in her final days. That last part, at least, was true. Elena had been passionate about documenting the Amazon's wildlife. Her camera had been constantly in hand, her excitement palpable with each new bird or insect spotted. If the jaguar had come for her while she was photographing the jungle she loved, perhaps there was a kind of brutal poetry in that. As for Marco, he had been in his element, navigating the river he'd known all his life. The jungle had been his home, and ultimately his grave. There were worse fates than returning to the earth that had nurtured you. And Sarah? What meaning could I find in her deliberate exit from a life that had become unbearable to her? Perhaps only this, that she had made a choice, exercising the one freedom guaranteed to all living things, the freedom to fight for survival or to surrender to death's embrace. I hadn't understood her choice, might never fully accept it, but I could acknowledge it as hers to make. Standing in that damp Seattle park, thousands of miles from the Amazon, yet carrying its lessons within me, I felt something shift. Not healing, I was too realistic to expect that, but movement, as Melissa had suggested, a current in the previously stagnant waters of my grief. I looked down at the colorful bracelet encircling my wrist. Protoselm. Not from death or loss or pain, those were inescapable, but perhaps protection from the greatest danger of all, the temptation to stop living while still alive. With that thought, I turned toward home, ready to begin the long process of navigating the river that remained to me, with all its hidden depths and unexpected currents. 3 months after returning from the Amazon, I stood on the banks of the Snoqualmie River, watching early autumn leaves spiral down to meet their reflections on the water's surface. The Pacific Northwest was entering its most beautiful season, a riot of color against evergreen backdrops, mornings crisp with fog, afternoons golden with slanting light. I came here often now, to this quiet spot, about an hour's drive from Seattle. Something about moving water had become necessary to me, not the dangerous power of the Amazon, but the gentler flow of this familiar river. Perhaps it was the constant movement, the reminder that stagnation was the enemy. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Melissa. Our weekly sessions had continued since that first meeting in the cafe. She'd helped me navigate the aftermath of the Amazon, the lingering nightmares, the flashbacks triggered by unexpected sounds or movements. More importantly, she'd helped me begin to integrate Sarah's death into my life narrative without letting it define me completely. The text was simple: remember to breathe. I smiled slightly, taking a deliberate deep breath as instructed. Early in our sessions, Melissa had noticed my tendency to hold my breath when discussing difficult topics, a literal holding pattern that mirrored my emotional state. The simple reminder to breathe had become our shorthand for staying present, even when memories threatened to pull me under. I texted back, breathing, river helping. Her response came quickly. Good, see you tomorrow. I pocketed the phone and continued my walk along the riverbank. The woven bracelet from the Amazon village was still on my wrist, faded now, but intact. I'd considered removing it several times, but always decided against it. It had become a talisman of sorts, a connection to an experience that, while traumatic, had also been transformative. 2 weeks after returning to Seattle, I'd finally spoken with Elena's sister, Maria. The conversation had been difficult, but cathartic for both of us. I'd told her about Elena's enthusiasm during the expedition, her talent for spotting wildlife before anyone else, her patience waiting for the perfect photograph. I'd edited the details of her death, focusing on the fact that it had been quick rather than describing the evidence we'd found in the clearing. She loved the Amazon, Maria had said through tears. Even knowing how it ended, I can't imagine her choosing to be anywhere else. Marco's family had been harder to connect with, a language barrier complicated by their more private grief. But Paolo had acted as intermediary, translating a letter I'd written expressing my sorrow and describing Marco's expertise and kindness during our brief acquaintance. The family had sent back a simple note of thanks, along with a small carved jaguar figure, acknowledgement of the predator's role in their cosmology, not as villain, but as force of nature. The carved jaguar now sat on my mantel alongside a framed photograph of Sarah, not her memorial photo from the funeral, but one I'd taken years earlier during a camping trip, her face alight with laughter as she toasted marshmallows over a campfire. Life and death, joy and sorrow, sharing the same space just as they did in the natural world. My life had developed new tributaries since the Amazon. I'd returned to work at the software company where I'd been employed before the trip, but with boundaries I hadn't maintained before. No more 60-hour weeks, no more artificial emergencies, no more sacrificing health for productivity. My near-death experience had clarified my priorities with brutal efficiency. I'd also begun volunteering at a crisis center, taking late-night shifts on the suicide prevention hotline. The training had been intensive, forcing me to confront my own unresolved feelings about Sarah's death. The work itself was often heartbreaking, but occasionally transcendent. Those moments when a connection formed across the phone line, when hopelessness yielded just enough to allow another day, another chance. And I'd started writing, not for publication, but for processing. The journal had been Melissa's suggestion, a way to externalize the thoughts that sometimes threatened to drown me. The entries began as fragmented impressions, raw and disjointed, but gradually evolved into more coherent reflections. Some focused on the Amazon, others on Sarah, still others on the day-to-day process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of multiple losses. As I walked along the Snoqualmie, I mentally composed a new entry. Something about rivers and their tributaries, about how a life course can be diverted by events both catastrophic and subtle, about how even the mightiest Amazon begins as countless small streams converging. A movement in the water caught my eye, a fish breaking the surface momentarily before disappearing back into the depths. Not a piranha, just a local trout or salmon. Yet the sight triggered a vivid flashback, blood in brown water, converging shadows, the frantic swim to shore. I stopped walking, closed my eyes, and practiced the grounding technique Melissa had taught me. 5 things I could see: the river, a Douglas fir, a red maple leaf, my hiking boots, a hawk circling overhead. 4 things I could touch: rough tree bark, the smooth stone in my pocket, my wool sweater, the woven bracelet. 3 things I could hear: water flowing, wind in branches, my own breathing. 2 things I could smell: damp earth, pine resin. 1 thing I could taste: the mint from the gum I'd been chewing. The flashback receded, leaving me firmly in the present moment, on this riverbank thousands of miles from the Amazon. The episodes were becoming less frequent, less intense. Progress, not perfection, as Melissa often reminded me. I continued walking until I reached my usual turning point, a large boulder overlooking a wider section of the river. I sat, unwrapping the sandwich I'd packed for lunch, watching an osprey hunt over the water with precise, patient circles. Life continued its flow, carrying me along in its current. There were still rapids ahead, still dangerous depths and hidden obstacles. There always would be. But I was learning to navigate them, to keep my head above water, to recognize when to fight the current and when to surrender to its direction. The Amazon had nearly killed me, had killed my companions, yet had also awakened me from the half-life I'd been living since finding Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken a confrontation with death to remind me how to live. I finished my lunch and stood, brushing crumbs from my lap. As I prepared to head back to my car, a family appeared on the trail, parents with 2 young children, all bundled in colorful jackets against the autumn chill. The children ran ahead, pointing excitedly at something in the water, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For a moment, watching them, I felt an echo of the old pain, the future with Sarah that would never be, the children we'd talked about but never had. But alongside that familiar ache was something newer and less expected, a quiet appreciation for this family's evident joy, for the simple human connection they represented. I nodded a greeting as they passed. The mother smiled in return, a brief acknowledgement between strangers sharing the same path for a moment before continuing on their separate journeys. That evening, back in my apartment, I wrote in my journal about rivers and tributaries, about life's unexpected turns, about the family on the trail. I wrote about Sarah and Elena and Marco, about how their stories had converged with mine before diverging permanently. I wrote about the Jaguar, the Piranhas, the village that had saved me, and I wrote about the woven bracelet that still circled my wrist, its colors faded, but its purpose intact. Protection. Not from death. That would come for me as it comes for all living things, whether by water or tooth or time. But protection against the temptation to stop living before death arrives. Protection against the stagnant pools of grief where nothing flows and nothing changes. Protection against forgetting that even the darkest river eventually reaches the sea. Outside my window, Seattle rain began to fall, gentle at first, then more insistent. I listened to its rhythm on the glass, a different music than the Amazon's torrential downpours, but part of the same global cycle of water, rising and falling, flowing and returning. I closed my journal and prepared for sleep, knowing that dreams of the Amazon might come, as they still sometimes did. But knowing too that I would wake from them, would breathe, would continue. The river of my life had been permanently altered by what had happened in those distant waters, but it still flowed, and I, somehow, flowed with it.